Something is building above the United Kingdom this summer that does not care about your plans, your garden, your commute, or your health service's ability to cope. It has been building for decades, accelerating year after year, and the data that scientists have gathered tells a story so clear and so consistent that dismissing it is no longer a matter of skepticism. It is simply a refusal to look at the numbers. This summer, the United Kingdom faces a heat threat that is unlike anything its infrastructure, its hospitals, its roads, or its population were designed to handle. And, for the first time in this country's history, the people warning you about it are not environmentalists at a march. They are the meteorologists at the Met Office, the epidemiologists at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the statisticians at the Office for National Statistics, and the clinicians at NHS England. When all of them are saying the same thing in the same year, it is time to stop and listen carefully. Let us start with the baseline. The Met Office issued its global forecast for 2026 in December 2025, and the central number in that forecast is 1.46 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average that existed between 1850 and 1900. That is the central estimate. The forecast range runs from 1.34 to 1.58 degrees. To understand why those numbers matter so much, you have to understand what they represent. The pre-industrial period is the reference point, the temperature of the planet, before human activity began systematically adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere at industrial scale. Every fraction of a degree above that baseline represents accumulated heat energy distributed across the entire climate system, changing weather patterns, extending dry seasons, intensifying rainfall events, and making extreme heat both more likely and more severe. Professor Adam Scaife, who leads the Met Office's global forecast team, stated clearly that the last 3 years have all exceeded 1.4 degrees, and that 2026 is expected to be the fourth consecutive year to reach that threshold. Prior to this recent run, global temperatures had never exceeded 1.3 degrees above the pre-industrial baseline. In just a few years, humanity has moved into territory that has no historical precedent in the observational record, going back to 1850. The Met Office's Dr. Nick Dunstone added an observation that deserves to be heard by every person in the United Kingdom this summer. He noted that 2024 saw the first temporary exceedance of 1.5 degrees, in the target ceiling set by the Paris Agreement as the threshold beyond which climate impacts become severe and increasingly irreversible. And he warned that the 2026 forecast makes another exceedance of 1.5 degrees possible. The Paris Agreement was signed in 2015 by almost 200 nations as a legally binding commitment to hold warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5. It was described at the time as one of the most significant environmental agreements in history. The target that 200 nations pledged to protect is now being regularly approached, and in 2024 briefly crossed. That is not an abstraction. That is the physical state of the atmosphere above the country you live in, and its consequences arrive as weather. The United Kingdom has already had its warning shot, and it came in the summer of 2022. On July 19th of that year, Coningsby in Lincolnshire recorded 40.3 degrees Celsius, the first time in documented British history that the temperature anywhere in the United Kingdom had exceeded 40 degrees. It was not a mild exceedance. It was a threshold that many climate scientists had previously suggested might not be reached until the middle of this century. It arrived decades early. The Met Office, which had never previously issued a red extreme heat warning in its history, issued one for the first time. Roads buckled, railway lines deformed, Luton Airport's runway surface damaged, causing flight disruptions. The London Fire Brigade experienced its busiest day on record, 2,496 calls to its control center, 359 incidents recorded, 106 fires attended, and 822 fire engines deployed in under 24 hours on the 19th and 20th of July. The brigade declared a major incident. Homes and nurseries burned. The human cost of that summer was not reported in real time with anything close to the prominence it deserved. The Office for National Statistics and the UK Health Security Agency conducted detailed analysis of excess mortality across all 5 heat periods recorded in England in summer 2022. Across those 5 heat periods, the estimated total excess mortality in those aged 65 and over was 2,803. The highest figure recorded since the Heatwave plan for England was first introduced in 2004. During the single most intense period, July 17th to 20th, excess mortality in that age group reached 1,012 deaths over just 4 days. That is 253 excess deaths per day above the baseline expected mortality rate. Parliament's Post note, published in May 2024 and drawing on ONS and UKHSA data, confirmed that across all 5 heat periods, an estimated 2,985 deaths in England were associated with the summer 2022 heat. Nearly 3,000 people killed by heat in Britain. In a summer that was supposed to be exceptional, unprecedented, a one-off. It was not a one-off, it was a preview. The Met Office's own scientific study, published in their weather journal in June 2025, used the unseen methodology, unprecedented simulated extremes using ensembles, to model the probability of extreme temperature events in the current climate. The findings were startling. The study found that the chance of the United Kingdom exceeding 40 degrees Celsius has been rapidly accelerating. It is now more than 20 times more likely than it was in the 1960s. The Met Office estimates a 50-50 chance of seeing a 40-degree day again in any given 12-year window. And the study found something that stretches the imagination of anyone who grew up associating Britain with gray skies and mild summers. In today's climate conditions, heat waves that last a month or more are now plausible outcomes. Dr. Nick Dunstone, who co-authored the study, noted that the well-known hot summer of 1976, still spoken about by older generations as something extraordinary, featured more than a fortnight above 28 degrees Celsius. The study found that in the current climate, conditions like those could persist for a month or longer. Britain's point of reference for what an extreme summer looks like is already outdated. Layered on top of the underlying warming trend is a specific meteorological factor that scientists are watching carefully for summer 2026. NOAA, the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has issued forecasts suggesting that a potential El Niño event during the second half of 2026 could be one of the strongest ever recorded. El Niño is a periodic warming of Pacific Ocean surface temperatures that disrupts global atmospheric circulation patterns. In Europe, it increases the probability of hot conditions over Spain and the continent. When that heat sits over southern Europe and the jet stream positions in a way that allows southerly airflows to reach Britain, the effects on UK temperatures can be dramatic and rapid. Jim Dale, a meteorologist for British Weather Services, stated that if the El Niño develops as currently forecast, there is a meaningful chance of very hot temperatures reaching Britain during the summer months. The Met Office has confirmed that El Niño generally increases the risk of warmer conditions affecting the United Kingdom, though the effects are moderated by competing atmospheric drivers. The combination of the underlying 1.46-degree global baseline and a potentially strong El Niño event is precisely the kind of scenario that produces record-breaking summer temperatures in Britain. In early April 2026, the Met Office recorded temperatures of 26 degrees Celsius in central and southeast England, values well above the early April average of the mid-teens. The Met Office's chief forecaster Paul Gunderson described it as a brief but notable spell of very warm weather for early April, with temperatures more typically associated with late spring or early summer arriving weeks ahead of schedule. This is not an anomaly in isolation. It is part of a pattern of seasonal temperature records being set progressively earlier, with warm conditions arriving sooner than historical baselines would predict. When April temperatures are reaching late May or early June levels, the question of what July and August will produce becomes more pressing with every passing week. The health system that will face the consequences of this summer is not built for 40 degrees. It is barely built for 35. The BMJ reported that NHS trusts across England recorded 4,131 incidents between April of 2020 and March 2021, in which ward or clinical area temperatures rose above 26 degrees, the threshold at which NHS England's own heatwave plan requires a risk assessment to be conducted and vulnerable patients to be protected. And that was during a period without a record heatwave. In 2022 and 2023 alone, the NHS in England recorded 6,822 instances of overheating in hospitals across the country. A third of the NHS estate was built before 1965. 14% of NHS infrastructure was built before the National Health Service itself was founded in 1948. These are buildings designed for a climate that no longer exists, housing patients who cannot always regulate their own body temperature, staffed by a workforce that is already stretched before a heat emergency begins. The most vulnerable populations in a UK heatwave are not randomly distributed. They are concentrated in specific communities, in specific housing types, and in specific age brackets. Parliament's post-note analysis identified that older people above 65 represent the largest category of heat-related mortality. People aged 85 and over face a mortality rate from extreme heat that is more than 4 times higher than those aged 65 to 75. Friends of the Earth's policy analysis, drawing on ONS census data, identified 1,920 specific neighborhoods in England where residents face the highest combined heat risk, areas where housing is more likely to overheat due to insulation below EPC Standard C, where a high proportion of residents live in flats or converted properties with poor ventilation, and where household incomes are too low to afford cooling solutions. These are not abstract statistics. They are specific postcodes where, if this summer reaches the temperatures that current data suggests are possible, people will die in their own homes. The economic cost of doing nothing about this is already being counted. NHS England has calculated that heat-related mortality in England alone costs £6.8 billion per year in economic terms, and that figure is projected to rise to £14.7 billion per year by the 2050s if current warming trajectories continue and adaptation measures are not significantly accelerated. The Climate Change Committee, the UK government's official independent climate advisory body, warned explicitly in its 2025 adaptation report that the United Kingdom's preparations for climate change are inadequate. That word inadequate, from a body that advises Parliament about preparations for the conditions that the Met Office is now forecasting to arrive this summer, should be deeply uncomfortable for anyone responsible for public policy in this country. Beyond mortality, the infrastructure consequences of a record summer are substantial and compounding. The 2022 heatwave demonstrated clearly that British roads, railways, and transport systems were not engineered for sustained extreme heat. Rail tracks deform at high temperatures, forcing speed restrictions that cascade through the entire network. Road surfaces soften and crack. Electrical systems in stations, depots, and signaling equipment overheat. Power infrastructure faces increased load as cooling demand rises across millions of homes and businesses simultaneously, while the generating capacity available can be compromised if cooling water sources for power stations are themselves too warm. Water stress becomes acute during prolonged heat events. Rivers drop, reservoir levels fall, and the interaction between a drought-intensified landscape and extreme temperatures creates wildfire risk in areas of Britain that have historically been considered too wet to burn. The 2022 fires in East London, Essex, and South Yorkshire changed that assumption permanently. Food systems are not immune. The Climate Change Committee has repeatedly highlighted that extreme summer heat reduces agricultural yields across the UK, disrupts supply chains, and feeds inflationary pressure on food prices that falls heaviest on households with the lowest incomes. The same communities identified as most vulnerable to heat-related mortality are also most vulnerable to the economic consequences of a heat-disrupted food system. The overlapping crises that a record summer can trigger do not arrive in sequence. They arrive simultaneously, and their interactions amplify each other in ways that no single agency or sector can manage alone. What makes the summer of 2026 different from previous warnings is the accumulation of evidence behind the forecast. This is not a single model run. It is not a headline generated from one scientist's projection. It is the convergence of the Met Office's global temperature forecast placing 2026 in the 4 warmest years on record, the NOAA El Nino alert suggesting a potentially extreme Pacific warming event in the second half of the year, the Met Office's own peer-reviewed research finding that 40-degree days in Britain are now more than 20 times more likely than in the 1960s, the April 2026 temperature anomalies already running weeks ahead of historical averages, and 3 consecutive years of global temperatures above 1.4 degrees without precedent in the observational record. Every one of these data points is independent. Every one of them is pointing in the same direction. The question that the United Kingdom has to answer honestly is not whether this summer will be warm. The question is whether it is prepared for what warm now means in a climate that has moved beyond the boundaries within which its infrastructure, its health system, its housing stock, and its emergency response plans were designed. The evidence gathered by the Met Office, the ONS, the NHS, Parliament's own researchers, and the academic community is not ambiguous. Heat waves in Britain are becoming longer. They are becoming hotter. They are becoming more frequent. The death toll they carry is measurable, documented, and avoidable only if the systems designed to protect people are actually capable of doing so. Based on the data available as of May 2026, there are serious reasons to doubt that those systems are ready. This is not a story about weather. It is a story about what happens when a country designed for one climate is asked to function in another. Britain built its roads, its hospitals, its homes, its railways, and its emergency plans for the climate it had. That climate is gone. And the summer of 2026 may be the year that the distance between what Britain was built for and what Britain's summers are becoming becomes impossible to ignore. There is one final data point that should sit with every person watching this. The Met Office unseen study did not only find that 40-degree days are more likely, it found that temperatures significantly above 40 degrees are now physically possible in the current UK climate, outcomes that would have been considered essentially impossible in the 1980s, and were still being treated as extreme tail risks as recently as 2015. The 2022 record of 40.3 degrees arrived at least 2 decades before many projections suggested it would. If the pattern of records arriving ahead of schedule continues, and the last decade of observational data strongly suggests it will, then the planning assumptions built around past extremes are already inadequate before this summer begins. The NHS heatwave plan was designed around thresholds built on historical data. The infrastructure stress testing that exists was built on precedent. But precedent is no longer a reliable guide to what is coming, because the climate generating the weather is no longer the same climate that produced the records in history. And for the people most exposed, the elderly living alone in poorly ventilated housing, the chronically ill managing conditions that heat makes life-threatening, the low-income households in urban heat islands, and the children in nurseries inside high-heat neighborhoods, none of them will be protected by a Met Office forecast if the systems meant to act on that forecast are not ready or resourced. Friends of the Earth identified 1,012 hospitals inside high-heat neighborhoods in England. In 2022 and 2023, those hospitals recorded thousands of overheating incidents under conditions that were not the worst-case scenario. If this summer exceeds 2022, those institutions will face demands the data suggests they cannot meet. The warning is clear. The data is real. The summer of 2026 is already underway.